Hello. Today we're going to be talking about F Schumacher, generally known as Fritz Schumacher, who to my mind was one of the great thinkers of the 20th century in a very positive way. He was born in Germany, in Bonn, in 1911, which by my calculations is 113 years ago, and he first came to England in 1930 as a Rhodes Scholar at New College, Oxford. He went away again when that was over, but came back just before World War II and was promptly interned as an enemy alien. In fact, he wasn't locked up, he was put to work on a farm, which was quite common in those days. And in his spare time, goodness knows how much spare time he had, but in his spare time, he wrote a number of economics papers. And these attracted the attention of John Maynard Keynes, no less, who said, you can't leave this man languishing on a farm, and got him a job as an advisor, an economic advisor, to the British government. After the war, he helped to get Schumacher a job in Oxford University as an academic, but then in 1950, Schumacher was appointed as chief economic advisor to the National Coal Board, as was in those days, and he stayed in that post until 1970. In 1966, again one might assume in his spare time, he founded what was called the Intermediate Technology Development Group. To my knowledge, it's the first time the expression intermediate technology has been used, but there we were. But in 2005, the ITDG changed its name to Practical Action, which is now very active still in, for example, South America, Africa, South Asia. Schumacher died in 1977, quite a young age, 66, but his legacy very much lives on. He is most famous for writing a wonderful book called Small is Beautiful, with the wonderful subtitle, A Study of Economics as If People Mattered. There's a thought. Well, here I am in Oxford to talk about Schumacher with Dr. Neal Harris.
Good morning.
He was a senior lecturer in sociology at Oxford Brookes University, and he's taking a special interest in Schumacher, his life and legacy. So, Neal, can I first ask you about Small is Beautiful? What is its sort of central message?
Well, thank you so much for having me here today, Colin. That's a brilliant introduction to Schumacher, who's a fascinating figure. There are so many other things as well you could have thrown into there. The idea of Small is Beautiful and the book actually emerged out of Schumacher's time working in what was then Burma, what is today Myanmar. And Schumacher was sent there as a British imperial civil servant. Shortly after, another famous British imperial civil servant, Eric Arthur Blair, more famously now known as George Orwell, had been sent to Burma. There's no knowledge that they necessarily met, and the times don't necessarily overlap, but it's interesting how these imperial histories connect. Anyway, so Schumacher was sent out to what is then Burma to think about questions of development. What are we going to do with this far-flung part of our glorious empire? And his solution, it was what became known as Buddhist Economics, which is very much at odds with the mainstream back then development paradigm. When Schumacher arrived, instead of going to his sort of presidential, imperial, ambassadorial suite, actually he went and spoke to the local people. What a horrendous, disastrous idea. And found out actually these ideas of smallness, of development in line with local values and principles in keeping with the Buddhism, which was pretty central to many people's lives and livelihoods. People understood what a good life would be. So Small is Beautiful in part comes out of Schumacher's experiences as a civil servant and his proposal for an alternative foundation for development, for a more sustainable form of society. But of course, it's a peculiar little book, and it's not just a text of Buddhist economics. And in fact, many of the philosophical foundations of the text vary massively from Buddhism. And in fact, in a paper that Lucy Ford and I have recently published, we argue that actually it could do with a bit more Buddhism, and that actually a lot of Christianity flows throughout the book as well, which actually puts it at odds with quite a lot of the contemporary environmental movement. So Small is Beautiful is a book which comes out of all of these experiences. It combines Buddhism, but also there's interest in Hinduism, quite an aggressive Christian metaphysics in there in places, as well as a whole panoply of ideas from various other theorists and thinkers.
It's a pity, of course, that he didn't meet George Orwell, because, I mean, they've had wonderful conversations. I'd love to know how they would have...
Absolutely, yes, yeah.
But there we are, I didn't. And as you said too, the ideas that he came up with, about development in particular, very much at odds with some standard ideas of the day. And I recall, because I'm very interested in agriculture, as you know, from the 1960s, a chap called Earl Butts, who was agriculture advisor to about 4 successive American presidents. And his great, in inverted commas, slogan was, get big or get out.
Yes, exactly.
And that is still, as it were, the leading paradigm, for want of a better word.
Exactly. And just, I mean, when you talk about Schumacher's biography and his influences, it's almost impossible to stop, because he was president of the Soil Association for a period of time as well. So obviously the links to agriculture as well as to ecology, but agriculture especially, particularly interesting.
Very good. Before we move on, what in fact, I mean, it's called Small is Beautiful. It wasn't exclusively small, but what does he identify as the advantages of smallness?
Well, as ever with academics, we have a perpetual battle with our publishers about what we want to call our books. And either you're in my sort of category and you come up with what you think is a really sexy title, and the publisher goes, no, we can't possibly call it that, and they give you a really boring response with many commas to try and sell it. Schumacher was a bit like Marx in the other view. His title was not Small is Beautiful. It was some particularly dry and bland suggestion. And it was the publisher that suggested, let's call it Small is Beautiful, a title which has since been described as being deliciously Freudian in its invitation to economic study. So what he means by smallness and smallness is beautiful is something of a misnomer. The book doesn't actually say that we just should do small economic engagements, or we should just focus on smallness. In fact, if we're going to have a title which truly reflects the content of the book, it would be Appropriate is Beautiful, rather than Small is Beautiful. What he's getting at here, though, and the provocation, and why the title is so important, is because he was identifying a presupposition across contemporary economics and policy and development policy that big is beautiful. So the phrase small is beautiful is more perhaps best understood as a rejection of what he called a gigantism of much contemporary economics. So by small is beautiful, he's not advocating we should only do small scale forms of economic policy or social policy. What he is saying here, however, is pause and be aware of the problematic foundation of neoclassical economics, of contemporary policy, that we need to grow and bigger is better and go big or get out. His argument is that is not what we should be doing as economists, as social thinkers, as activists, as nations. Instead, we need to think differently about the ends to which economic growth is structured. And growth for its own sake is not something at all that he would be in favour of.
But what did he see as a particular advantage of not being big?
That's a very good question. I don't think he explicitly wrote a section saying, here's a list of 10 reasons why big economies are bad, but instead what he did, and I think this is what makes him so attractive as a thinker, and in this regard he connects with a whole range of academics and philosophers perhaps, in which he sought to draw out the hidden agenda of economics. He sought to draw out what he called the meta-economic foundations. Schumacher argued that economics is a derived discipline, that it's based on an implicit set of foundations, which he calls meta-economics. And the problem for Schumacher is that the meta-economic choices, which have been baked into capitalism and, importantly, the Soviet models of growth as well, were deeply mistaken. And he identified very clearly these meta-economic foundations, such as gigantism, such as perpetual growth, and also a sense that all commodities are of equal worth. There is no ontological difference between what is bought and sold, between whether it's goats or pencils. The market, on its meta-economic calculus, doesn't distinguish any fundamental worth between living matter that is renewable, living matter that is non-renewable, or non-living matter, or organic or synthetic matter. And this is a real problem. So Schumacher's book doesn't necessarily say here's 10 fundamental problems with bigness, but instead it unpicks a whole series, bigness being one of these, of fundamental axioms, for want of a better word, which are encoded and somewhat hidden or implicit within contemporary economics. Bigness was, or gigantism, to use his term, being one of those.
And of course, when you use the word contemporary, for him that would have been the 1970s, the mid-20th century, but it's still exactly the same now in the 2020s.
It's remarkable. I mean, so my colleague Lucy Ford, who we produced this special issue on Schumacher together in the European Journal of Social Theory, and we got thinking about Schumacher because it was 50 years last year since the publication of Small is Beautiful. But it's terrifying how many of the global ecological, political systems, crises remain the same. Back when Small is Beautiful was published, we were seeing terrifying new technological developments back in the 70s, just as we have the rise of ChatGPT and AI today. There was a conflict between the West and Russia. Well, again, the parallels are there. Oil crises with spiraling costs, questions not just of sustainability, but also affordability, concerns around political change, questions of what kind of future actually is out there. So the political situation, bizarrely, 50 years changes. There are some remarkable parallels. One thing that's worth stressing, though, is that there is a difference, a big difference, when we think about environmental concerns, particularly like I'm interested in doing from a theoretical perspective, working through concepts, theories, perspectives, and trying to understand society and trying to understand the role that the ecology has within society, is that back in the 1970s, the problem that Schumacher was faced with, as you say, the chief statistician and a key figure in the National Coal Board, was the sense that we were running out of resources. There wasn't enough coal left. We can't possibly rely on OPEC because that evil cartel will reduce our access. We won't have enough stuff. Whereas today, we not only know scientifically that environmental challenges are real and pressing and existential, but our challenge isn't one so much of we're going to run out of this stuff, which it was until quite recently. Now the challenge is the political and social will to, in the phrasing, to keep the oil in the soil and the coal in the hole. And this is a big difference in the passing of 50 years as well. Similarities and differences across the period.
Very interesting. One little point before we move on again, I'm very interested in the subtitle of Schumacher's book, Economics as if People Mattered. I suppose if he was writing today, or even then, he could have said as if people and the natural world matter. But of course, in the modern economy, one might say neither matters actually.
Absolutely. But I think that's also particularly interesting, and that connects with a concern that Lucy and I had when we were reflecting on Schumacher's work. He's a really interesting scholar, but as academics, we try and always engage critically with our area of study. And Schumacher is certainly, he's certainly not perfect. I don't want to come across as presenting some kind of hagiography of Schumacher. As I sort of hinted at earlier on, in many ways his work is, and I use this term deliberately, infected by an aggressive Christian metaphysics. And the subtitle, An Economics as if People Matter, is very much indicative of this Christian metaphysics. Schumacher's ultimate argument is that we've forgotten, quote, our great Christian heritage, end quote, a line from Small is Beautiful. And in this regard, what he's arguing is that the current economic system doesn't understand the role of man, in Schumacher's terms, as sort of the person who has control or dominion over the natural world, and instead mankind is part of this economic calculus without necessarily having the position as steward, which comes from his later Catholicism. So I would stress that this subtitle is both perhaps out of time in keeping with more contemporary metaphysics when it comes to the relationship we view between humankind and the rest of the natural world. But it also isn't just a slip. It's not just the case that he forgot to put something there. It also does reflect ideas that Schumacher held particularly deeply, ideas which come from a Christian faith in a way which ironically displaces ideas, a very different metaphysics which would come from the Buddhist side of social and political thought, for which ironically he's far more famous.
Yeah. It's that you just use the word dominion, which is the Christian, Judeo-Christian idea, and you say later it gave rise to stewardship. But if you look at the Eastern religions, including Buddhism, we go beyond that, beyond stewardship, which implies us and them, to this concept which is commonly known as oneness. We are. Yeah. Would you care to expand on that at all?
Yes. I mean, so for me, I lay my cards on the table. I'm not merely an atheist. I would describe myself more as an anti-theist. I don't just not believe that there isn't a God, but I quite like that idea. I'm quite happy with that idea. I'm not miserable about the fact that I don't think God exists. And instead, what I turn to is less the religious aspects of ecological theory, but I'm interested in turning to some of the contemporary philosophies of ecology, which can be really, really rich, which don't rely on there being a God out there for us to want to care for and look after each other and our natural world. And that's where I think Schumacher is interesting, because he provides this injunction to return to metaphysics, to question what is the nature of being when we're talking about the ecology, something which obviously conventional capitalist economics tries to shy away from. Things must be commodified, the nature of things itself must be ignored. Everything should be seen as being of equal standing in a calculus which is of dead, dull, lifeless matter. But there are ecological theorists, people like Bruno Latour, for instance, who, ironically enough, is, as well as being famous for his vineyards, was a Catholic. He passed away, I believe, a few years ago. But Latour provides us with a metaphysics which is really interesting for those thinking around ecology today, in which he says that we need to fundamentally embrace everybody within our collective metaphysics. We need to be thinking that the fundamental nature of being isn't different between humanity and trees, or humanity and rivers. And this is something which places him very much at odds with Christian metaphysics, which suggests there is something fundamentally distinct of higher worth to man and humanity. Francis Fukuyama, who's today probably better known for his books on the end of history and the fall of the Berlin Wall, and his idea that we've reached the end of mankind's ideological journey. Well, he also wrote about this idea of there being a red line in metaphysics between Christian and non-Christian metaphysics, in which we have a view of mankind as either being different from the animals and the rest of the natural world, or as part of it, as there being a fundamental commonality. So I think it's interesting to turn to any system of thought, religious or not, which helps us to see beyond the problematic notion that humanity sits one side of this red line of distinct philosophical standing, distinct in some kind of hierarchy of being. And I think, as Latour tries to do, pushing beyond that division is really important for us to make a real change to our current ecological crisis.
Right. But to go back to a point you made at the beginning, you don't see a role. I mean, to me, the idea of God is not that God exists, but I think roughly as you said, the idea of God is actually a good idea, because it suggests that there is an arbiter, there's somebody who actually gives a damn, etc., that we are in fact answerable. Are you rejecting that as well, or not?
Yes, very much. The idea of giving a damn and damnation, and the sense that there is an arbiter up there. I don't think we need that. I think that when we look at the beauty and wonder and majesty of the world around us, and we see the harm that's occurring to the natural world, I don't think we need recourse to a creator to be able to think this is wonderful and we need to be doing more to protect our environment. And I think what's particularly problematic, and this is where Latour's interesting for me, is he says we've had too much time fighting amongst ourselves about ancient prejudices around this religion or that religion, this metaphysics or that metaphysics. And in fact, what we need to do is to be expanding the collective of actors. We need to be saying, actually, we don't need to be focusing excessively on a particular framing of this or that, of subject or object in more philosophical terms. Instead, what Latour suggests is we need to be just more open to the fact that there is moral worth, or there is worth to the natural world more broadly. And I think a notion of there being that we need to necessarily return to one particular religion especially is quite difficult and problematic, because that tends to exclude those who either are not religious or everybody else who is religious and has a different worldview. Yeah, sure. So I would sit closer to, I suppose, a Marxian ecology, something that tries to combine the best bits of a Marxist foundation with a green foundation, in a way that can hopefully be attractive to everybody who sees fundamental contradictions in the way the capitalist economy works, that's at odds with sustainability, that's at odds with a more harmonious relationship between people and planet.
Jolly good. Can I just quote you cite a few quotes from Schumacher, from What is Beautiful, on the nature of Buddhism and why he's attracted to it. See if you could comment on them. He says, "The Buddhist sees the essence of civilization not in the multiplication of wants, but in the purification of the human character." Any comment on that?
That's a really interesting question. If you were going to do an economics course at most universities in the UK or in the US, and you are asked, okay, yeah, so where's the module on the purification of human character? And we've done clear metrics this week. We've looked at supply side stuff. Where's the human character in this? You're not going to find it there. You've got to remember this book, Small is Beautiful, is presented as being about economics. The very fact he's writing about the human character that can be changed in some ways, irrespective of what religion or values or norms, the very fact that he's talking about human character in the context of a discussion of economics, that in itself is fascinating. And I would suggest, to his credit, and the fact that this isn't part of conversations occurring in mainstream economics classes and textbooks today, is to the detriment of the subject at the moment. That's, of course, a crucial consideration. As far as Schumacher is concerned, this notion of macroeconomics, which is really important to him, these fundamental presuppositions upon which economics is predicated, is of two parts. It is of a study of the environment in which humans are in, and of humans themselves. And if we look at the way much contemporary economics is taught and understood, neither of these are given sufficient theoretical engagement. The fundamental presuppositions of neoclassical economics are taken for granted, and there isn't any real concern on political economy in most mainstream economics departments at universities today. And even where that is done, you will find very few institutions where they focus explicitly on questions of character or on the malleability of the human character. In contrast, there's just an acceptance in the vast majority of economics programs on the basic, ideal, typical, utility maximizing, self-interested liberal subject upon which Victorian era capitalism was based.
Very good. Let's skip the next one. And he goes on to say, the aim should be to obtain the maximum of well-being with the minimum of consumption. Again, a very big statement.
Absolutely. So if you look at Bhutan, for instance, they have this framing of gross national happiness rather than gross domestic product. And this suggests that there are many different ways of measuring the success of an economy, many different ways of measuring the point to which social activities are orchestrated. And what we do with what economists call the social surplus, once we've produced the bare necessities of human life, we've got this extra time to do stuff. What do we do with that? What do we do with our additional stuff, the surplus that we can produce? And when we adopt a Buddhist economic approach, for instance, we can get closer to these concerns of happiness and of an economics where people matter, rather than that surplus being solely to maximise the bottom lines of multinational corporations.
Of course, in the West, we do have this idea that we should be trying to improve happiness. I mean, as in the American Declaration of Independence, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But there's this idea, too, that happiness increases depending on your material wealth, which is deeply pernicious. And, of course, Schumacher's saying the complete opposite of that.
Exactly. And if you think about the pandemic of mental health issues, of anxieties, of eating disorders, that are sweeping across the global north, I think this is a cause for alarm to all parents and teachers, anybody who has a regular role talking to young people today. Obviously, it's not just a concern for young people, but the extent to which it is growing as a concern decade upon decade. We talk about things such as climate anxiety serving to further expedite and exaggerate this real deep ability for people to enjoy life. Opulence, material wealth, is no substitute for somebody who's suffering seriously from mental health issues. And the relationship that exists between mental health issues and the economy is something which needs to be given far more consideration. Just as I've been writing recently about the F Schumacher, there's another scholar called Erich Fromm who I'm very interested in. And I have a couple of PhD students at the moment who are working on Fromm's ideas. And Fromm's particularly interesting because he makes the argument in a book called The Sane Society that actually if society is structured in such a way which is deeply irrational and destructive to human well-being and to the environment, and fundamentally is solely orchestrated to enable the maximum life chances of a tiny, tiny percentage, and you live a world that is alienating, the natural, healthy, in scare quotes, normal response to such a capitalist society would be to develop neuroses and anxieties. The problem is not just necessarily to medicate these people into compliance with a sick society. Those people are behaving normally and naturally to be unwell and anxious and neurotic. What you need to change is the society itself. Very good. The issue is the sick society, and that requires structural changes and structural transformations. So where Schumacher talks about the various problems which are embedded within the economy, solving these problems is a way not merely to having a more sustainable environment, but it's also a way of having a healthier and happier population as well.
And I'm also, one of the bees in my bonnet is that the whole idea of happiness has been corrupted. I mean, it tends to be equated in the West with hedonism.
Exactly.
And I'm suggesting that the word we really need is fulfillment.
I very much agree.
Good. I'll just give you one last quote from Schumacher talking about Buddhism. The Buddhist economist would insist that a population basing its economic life on non-renewable fuels is living parasitically on capital instead of income. Such a way of life could have no permanence and could therefore be justified only as a purely temporary expedient.
Absolutely. And this returns us to the point I was making a couple of minutes ago, that back in the 1970s, the concern wasn't that we've got pretty much enough resources to destroy the conditions for life on Earth. The concern back then was we're running out of this stuff. And in many ways, what's terrifying is to think, oh my goodness, if only we'd run out of all of that stuff, we may have been forced to have moved more quickly to a renewable, to a more green, to a more sustainable society. But it's worth reflecting on that quote. Well, of course, I think most people today would agree with the fact that infinite consumption of finite resources isn't a great idea. But the sense that, oh shit, we've managed to find more of those resources to consume. And that's the problem. Back then, the issue was we're going to run out. Yeah. But today, the issue is not so much we're going to run out of resources as it was for Schumacher. The issue is we're going to keep finding those resources and we're going to keep consuming them and that is going to lead to environmental harm that poses an existential threat to life on Earth.
Yeah, existential.
Human life on Earth especially.
Existential in this context, meaning
life and death.
Yeah, sure. The revert to what you were saying earlier about Schumacher not being particularly, as it were, committed to Buddhism per se, but this quote, "The choice of Buddhism for this purpose is purely incidental. The teachings of Christianity, Islam or Judaism could have been used just as well as those of any of the other of the great Eastern tradition."
That's a really interesting quote, and it suggests that he's somewhat homeless when it comes to his philosophical foundations here. We've got to remember fundamentally that Schumacher is a statistician. He's not a theologian, he's not a social theorist, and while he gives us concepts and theories, ideas such as meta-economics, which I think are really important and really worth engaging with, he's not somebody who spends his life studying philosophy. He's not a religious scholar. He's not got a rigorous foundation in epistemology, ontology, or metaphysics. He is actually a very, very good economist, statistician. He's a numbers guy at a fundamental level. So for him, he's turning to these traditions on the basis to see what use he can find in them to help him respond to what is fundamentally a mechanical concern, that we are using up our resources too quickly. And this concern is one which is more scientific, mechanical. It's an engineer, it's a statistician. So he's turned to what we may view more as philosophy. This isn't done because he has necessarily a fundamental urge to uncover the core truth of any of these particular ways of seeing the world. But that again is interesting, that he's a statistician who turns to religion. Just as he's an environmentalist, we think of him today as a chief environmentalist, a prophet, but actually his concern was we're running out of oil, running out of coal in particular. He ran the National Coal Board. The irony that we have somebody who ran the National Coal Board who we're talking about today is an innovator for green thinking. He's a statistician who talks about metaphysics. He's the coal board guy who we turn to for interest in economics. He's a Buddhist whose metaphysics actually is overwhelmingly, and I say problematically, Christian. He's a web of contradictions, but in part that's why he's so fascinating.
And of course it all hangs together, despite the contradictions, it all hangs together as a unified whole rather well, I think.
I think there's increasing debate about the extent to which the book itself, Small is Beautiful, hangs together well or not. And I think various subsections of it hang together better than others. The section on Buddhist economics and his notions of macroeconomics, I would suggest, are by far the most interesting and the most coherent. But there are other sections of Small is Beautiful which you can see are just thrown together a bit. There's some lecture notes, there's some ideas, and they are all pretty much whacked together in a way that makes it a peculiar little book. I wouldn't necessarily say it's the most coherent or the most perfectly structured book. And as I say, I'm certainly not here to offer sort of a hagiography of Schumacher. I think it's really important that we engage critically with all thinkers. When we face a challenge such as global warming, it's important we don't uncritically accept anything and try and find the strengths and the weaknesses and to find the real jewels that are there. So as to whether Small is Beautiful hangs together well or not, I would say the jury's still out on that one. But I would say that some of his criticisms of capitalist and, at that point, Soviet, giantist economics, I would say they are particularly coherent and some of the best sections of the book, which are the most worth reading.
Although you're suggesting Schumacher's thesis is not, as it were, coherent, not all-embracing, nevertheless one feels in essence it's much closer to where we need to be than where we are. So the big question is, how do we get from where we are to something more Schumacherish and something more appropriate to our fate, to our plight?
Absolutely right. And I couldn't agree more that the real question is, what do we do? How do we get there? In a more Leninist vibe, what is to be done? And I certainly don't have the answer to that question. What I would say, though, is that Schumacher has a lot to offer when he's not talking about a particular roadmap to the future. He doesn't necessarily offer that. But I think there is too much of a preconception that you're only adding something of value when you're suggesting a positive. My training is within a tradition called the Frankfurt School of critical theory, the Frankfurt School of critical theory. And there's this notion of critique, C-R-I-T-I-Q-U-E, critique, which suggests that by identifying the contradictions and the challenges which are at the core of the social whole, the social totality, this practice of disclosing these contradictions, just as a process of identifying negatives, this can be part of a political praxis, part of a transition to making things better. So in part, I think we need to be open to the fact that there's more merit than we realise in critical work. And Schumacher, I think, is at his best when he's talking about the limitations of contemporary meta-economics. So embracing the value of critique, embracing the importance of criticism, not just as a foundation for going on to do positive research or producing a roadmap, but critique as part of that roadmap itself, as a way of disclosing contradictions in not just what we're thinking, but in how we're thinking. Critique as a form of epistemology, as a form of political epistemology, shaping how we think, challenging our preconceptions, and this being a crucial part of a transformative green socialist agenda. In terms of what needs to be done in the immediacy, in terms of policy.
So before we go on to that, let me just ask something. What you're saying seems to me it's about changing one's point of view, one's mindset, etc. Obviously, that has immediate implications for education, which after all is your thing. What do you see as the kind of educational changes or approaches that we really need?
That's a really important question. At the moment, I have a sense that the humanities and the social sciences are seen as something of an indulgence. They're seen as something as, well, if you've got enough money and you've got a particularly rich family, you can go off and study literature for 3 years, and how lovely. But there's a sense that that's not going to do anything for you. It's not going to help solve problems. It's not going to get you a job. It's not particularly rewarding. I think this is exactly the attitude that we need to challenge rigorously. Because as Schumacher teaches, economics is a derived discipline. It is derived from meta-economics, from our values, our choices, the way we think about the world. And that without having a rigorous normative foundation, without having a clear sense of this is what we want, this is what the good life should be, this is what we should value, then you can have all the technologies in the world, but they'll simply drive you towards damnation. So I think what we need to have is a revaluation of the importance of the arts, the social sciences and the humanities, the subjects that make us think to what are the ends that our society is organised. What does a good life look like? And I think at exactly the moment that these questions are becoming more and more important, they are given less weight and standing. In part, I consider this to be a result of the broader neoliberalisation of the academy, both in the UK, but more broadly. I think we need to stop thinking about education fundamentally as an instrumental stepping stone that can be measured in terms of employability outcomes to help you become a good capitalist in the broader neoliberal environment. But instead, education must have something to do with one's ability to think critically about the world around you. And for that, the social sciences, the humanities and the arts, I think these subjects need to be fought for, particularly in the UK higher education landscape at the moment, where these subjects are under threat, where there are layoffs, where a disastrous and poorly implemented move to making education seen as a commodity over the last 2-3 decades. In the UK, the results of that are now truly being felt in a way which is causing tremendous harm to students as much as it is to the environment of learning more broadly. So I would suggest what is required is to really call for the value of the arts, the social sciences and the humanities, because these are the subjects upon which we can orchestrate and direct the wonderful products of other subjects and other disciplines. The sciences, the hard sciences, these can be directed and attuned according towards the goals that we think our society should be organised.
Cool. But at the moment, of course, there's this emphasis on the subjects that are called STEM.
Yes.
Science, technology, engineering, mathematics.
Exactly.
Care to add a comment to that, or just not bother?
I think that those subjects are tremendously valuable, and it certainly shouldn't be a case of saying one subject is better than another. I don't think that gets us anywhere. But I do think without a rigorous foundation in the arts, the social sciences and humanities, a society which is solely driven by STEM subjects will have all of the tools, but no idea what to do with them. Questions of meaning, of purpose, these are questions which refer to us as humans. They're questions for the humanities. So I don't want to be seen as attacking STEM subjects, which are truly important and definitely have a role in the development of technologies and of innovations, which can only be a positive thing if calibrated through a particular understanding of the goals and objectives society should be orchestrated towards, which is created by the arts, the social sciences and the humanities. I think this move towards valuing STEM subjects in part comes from a desire to view the university and to view the academy as a site for training people up to get work within the neoliberal economy. And I think if that's all we view university education as being, a stepping stone to employability, I think we lose some of the joy and the wonder and the majesty of what asking questions, curiosity, the joys of that the humanities and social sciences can bring, in addition to their really important practical role in helping us challenge our ecocidal course that we're currently on.
Interesting. One thing strikes me as being what you might call a little irony here, is that the people, in fact, who have been focusing on issues of metaphysics and morality and so on, are the clerics and the theologians who you actually were rejecting.
I think it's twofold. The irony is here. One is that the people who are telling you that you should do STEM rather than the social sciences, the humanities, are overwhelmingly PPE educated Oxford scholars in the first place, which suggests that this movement to certain subjects perhaps reflects a class dimension. That, well, there should be a small group of typically privately educated, rich white men who have had the luxury of a PPE education, and that they should continue to be able to enjoy this indulgence. But for the rest of you, you need to be simply thinking about your maximum employability within a predetermined social structure, and don't waste your time thinking about the ends to which that structure is organised. So I would say that's one irony, that the people who are calling for, who are bringing forth this neoliberal hypervalorization of subjects which aren't necessarily fundamentally critical at their core foundation, have enjoyed access to critical subjects to start off with. And then secondly, yes, as to your point, it's definitely the case that a lot of the people who talk about metaphysics are those who come from a more theological bent. However, just because you're talking about metaphysics doesn't mean the conversations you're having is helpful. As Lucy and I wrote in our paper on Schumacher, the foundation of much Christian metaphysics is that humanity is superior to the rest of the natural world. So it's not so much a case that people are talking about metaphysics and that's necessarily a good thing. We need to have a metaphysics that encourages environmental sustainability. Part of the conversation is, let's get back to metaphysics. Let's not just have a reified, alienated relationship with the economy, in which all that matters is increasing growth. And that's really important. But at the same time, it's not a case that any metaphysics will do. We need to have an awareness that humans are very much part of the natural world, and that any attempt to create an artificial distanciation in terms of moral worth is going to have consequences. And while Schumacher hunted around to try and find a metaphysics that would enable him to connect with this, I don't think he ever was truly happy with any of the great monotheisms or any of the Eastern traditions, because, as we said, he turns to all of them. If he found one that ticked all of the boxes, perhaps would be more likely he would have stayed there. His turn to Catholicism, in part, was perhaps just a desire to have a home. And his daughter, in an excellent book about F Schumacher, spoke about him being spiritually homeless, and one can read between the lines that perhaps his ultimate move to Catholicism wasn't necessarily a sense that he felt Catholicism had all of the answers, but he just wanted to have a particular place to hang his hat for his religious beliefs.
Sure. Last question then. If you were actually in charge of education, let's say in this country, how would you change things? What would your priorities be?
I mean, reflecting on what Schumacher teaches and reflecting on the broader environmental landscape at the moment, I would suggest it would be really, really important to have more of a focus and an appreciation and a value for critical subjects, where students get a chance to reflect upon the norms and values which are encoded into our society, our institutions, and a chance to think critically about whether or not this is the direction we wish our society to be pointed towards. So in terms of policy, I would like to see increasing value put towards advertisements for a sense of a triumph and support for the humanities and the social sciences, which I think have a crucial role to play in dealing with the environmental challenges we face. And I think that it's a particular crisis that is exactly the moment we need to be reflecting more on the aims to which our economy, our society, our education system is orchestrated, that there is a squeeze and a pressure and a lack of regard for exactly the subjects which can help us point to the limitations in the way society is currently structured.
Very good. Thank you very much.
Thank you.